he was an MI5 operative during the 20s. During the 20s with the Bolsheviks and what have you, there was a bit of concern in England over Russians infiltrating newspapers and what have you. So MI5 were getting MI5, spies and what have you, to track people that were potential sympathizers and what have you. So Sidney Russell Cooke, Captain Smith's son-in-law, was one of them. But he did a terrible job. And again, going back to what you're saying about not falling in love, the book really shows how he messed up his mission. And whether this also ties into his mysterious death later is again something I've done as much research as possible to place all the pieces there, and then let the reader be the Sherlock Holmes and come up with their conclusion.
Welcome to Season 3 of Titanic Talk. Nelson Aspen and Alexandra Boyd launch once again onto the digital airwaves with some very special event episodes. Here we feature stories from the independent documentary Ship of Dreams Titanic Movie Diaries and continue to explore all aspects of the iconic ship, from James Cameron's epic, groundbreaking movie to the history and legacy of Titanic herself. Actors, historians, authors, descendants and fans come here to talk about Titanic. This is your first-class ticket to everything aboard the Ship of Dreams. Ship of Dreams Titanic Movie Diaries is distributed in the US by Freestyle Digital Media. It's now available to rent or own on Apple TV, Amazon, and many other platforms. Please be sure to like and leave a review.
I'm Nelson Aspen, and we're so glad you're back for another episode of Titanic Talk. I'm fresh off the plane from Belfast, and it lived up to all my Titaniac expectations. I hadn't been there in a quarter century, and that was before Titanic had taken over the city. So more on that later. But if you haven't yet been to see all the glories of Titanic's birthplace in Belfast, I highly recommend it. I also highly recommend seeing Ship of Dreams Titanic Movie Diaries, the documentary that spawned this podcast and all the glorious friends we have made as a result. When my lovely co-host Alexandra Boyd and I recently went to Titanic weekend on the 113th anniversary of the sinking, we boarded the Queen Mary in Long Beach, California, and one of the other guest speakers, fellow Titaniac, has become a close friend and colleague of ours. So we are excited to bring her to you today, in case you haven't already met her. Alexandra, will you do the introductions? I'm Nelson Aspen, and I'm very excited to be back with my lovely co-host, Alexandra Boyd, for another rousing podcast episode of Titanic Talk. And we have such a diverse roster of guests that we enjoy so much. And this one is no exception. We just came across this fellow. I think originally it was from some sort of Instagram or Google commentary, whatever. The way the universe just keeps feeding us fascinating people is a real gift. And we tracked him down, and I've read his book, and I can't wait to talk about it with him. Alexandra, will you do the honors?
I will. Without further ado, it is Dan E. Parks, and we'll talk about his E a little bit, maybe. And actually, to answer your question about how we found him, we now have to constantly recognize the concentric circles in which we swirl, which is that all roads, if you're on a Titanic path, will lead somehow across our path. I hope, whether it's in the past, now, or in the future. And I do believe Dan came to us via the British Titanic Society, because my movie screened at their last April get-together in Liverpool. And also, Dan needs to know, one of our really loyal fans, Lauren, she was like, "You've got to talk to Dan. He knows all about Captain Smith." I was like, all right then. Definitely. Let's get him on.
And that's right. And he wrote the new book about Captain Smith and his daughter and her husband, the spy, which is what the subject of this podcast episode is. But we had trouble getting the book. So we went to Dan himself, and as authors ourselves, we know how challenging this can be. So you're right. Let us meet the author, a director of photography, a Titaniac of the first order, Dan E. Parks. Welcome to Titanic Talk, Dan.
Thank you very much. What a fantastic introduction. I'm humbled by it.
And tell us approximately, without giving us your GPS location, where in the world are you?
I live on the south coast of England. In fact, I can see from my window the English Channel. So
Okay.
not that I'm on the section where the Titanic would have gone past, but I can kind of imagine what it would be like.
Gosh,
Yes, I'm
are
in
there any
southern
boats coming
England.
over full of people at the moment, or is it a clear day?
Yeah, I don't think they'll be trying today. It's we've actually got a storm hitting the UK today, but that's hitting up north, so we're kind of avoiding that a little bit today.
Right. Well, I'm very proud to show off your magnificent book, Titanic Legacy, The Captain, the Daughter, and the Spy. And it is a very thorough, extremely well-researched, and still entertaining read about the always controversial Captain Smith. So to start us off, what was we're all Titaniac, so we always like to know what the origin story is for someone who is enthusiastic about Titanic, but specifically, tell us how you got from that into Captain Smith specifically.
Yeah, I think my interest, it started in the late 80s, was more generally the ship, the design, construction, what have you. But as I went on, became more curious about the control center, the bridge, and what happened in the bridge, and then specifically the deck officers. And so by the late 90s, and especially with James Cameron's film, when it came along, and its portrayal of First Officer Murdoch, I became keenly interested in the officers. And so I've researched them for many years. But funny enough, like you mentioned about Captain Smith being controversial,
Mm-hmm.
until maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I was of the opinion that Captain Smith wasn't particularly competent. That he should have retired. He was kind of, he was beyond his use by date, for want of better expression. So my opinion, once I did the research for the book, I kind of had to kind of eat my words in some ways because I realized I got it wrong.
Well, you tell it very fairly into sort of the two camps of Captain Smith. Was he, we know that he was popular with his passengers, but was he to blame? Was he, like you say, past his sell-by date, or was he a hero? There are so many countering stories to his character, to his job performance, and yet you've provided us with a really exhaustive biography. Where did you go initially? I mean, we live in a Google world, but where did you start your investigation?
It was very much newspaper archives, and in England we've got some really fantastic archives. The British Library is just a gold mine. If you ever get a chance to visit London, go to the British Library and just start exploring, it's incredible what you can discover. And I spent many hours there, as well as a lot of other archives online, and did the legwork, going to Liverpool, visiting the various houses that he lived in, talking to the residents. For me, I wrote the book for the Titanic nerd inside of me. So it's, in a way, I've tried not to be biased. I've tried to lay out all the information. So there's negative information about Captain Smith. I don't paint him as a hero at all. There's some quite negative moments during his life that I've not whitewashed. But by the same token, I've also shown the other side, which is very rarely spoken about, which is the fact that he was considered a very competent captain. People seem to focus on some of the negatives, like the Olympic Hawk collision, for example, and without actually knowing the details of that. So hopefully the book kind of illuminates people with what really happened, but also in an unbiased way, so they can make their own conclusions. For me, he's not a hero, he's not a villain, he's human. And that's what I hope the book shows, and especially in regards to what effect it had on his family, hence
Well,
the
yes, I
title
was going to
Titanic
say,
Legacy.
Being a family man is the most human thing about him, which we never think about. That we so often think about Titanic victims and survivors and who they were with, but we don't seem to give a thought about who did Captain Smith leave behind, and that's the premise of your book, and we do see him as a family man, and whether it's humanizing him with a photo of a dog, which may or may not have actually been his dog, or finding out about his widow, and even though they were very privileged, what a tragic legacy was left to his daughter Mel.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because I just noticed recently on Facebook. People always post that famous photograph of Captain Smith's widow and Mel, their only child, only daughter, and yet in that photograph she's maybe only a year or so old. In actual fact, when the Titanic sank, April 1912, her birthday was the 2nd of April. She had just turned 14, so she was no baby. She was a teenager at school, and what a horrific thing to lose your father, who was on the cusp of retirement, but then also to be living in a city where, as you no doubt have heard, in Southampton, almost every street had somebody lost. There were schools where almost every child had a parent that was affected by the disaster. So you had this incredible negative environment where people are wanting to find someone to blame. And it's interesting at the moment with the Air India air crash, how when in that case the pilots obviously died. It's very easy to start pointing the blame at someone who's died because they can't defend themselves. And of course we can't make a judgment on that because the report hasn't come out. But in the case of Titanic, I think that did happen to some degree, where because Smith couldn't defend himself, it was very easy just to point the finger and say, well, he was to blame. And people make assumptions. They make assumptions like he was going too fast, that he ignored iceberg warnings, and he did neither. These assumptions are, incorrect, and hopefully the book illuminates that.
What you're also pointing out is that a pilot doesn't intend to crash his airplane, and a captain doesn't intend to drive his boat into an iceberg. And over again, over the hundreds and thousands of reports and the stories and the investigations about the disaster of Titanic, there was a catalogue of unfortunate events that led to not just hitting the iceberg. That was just the beginning of the tip of it. It was all the other factors. And of course, what we also know is that a captain must go down with his ship, and a captain, we've been talking about filmmaking, a director, somebody said to me once, if something goes wrong, whatever goes wrong, it's the director's fault, not the producer, the actor, or the makeup department. It all comes to the person who's in charge. And that, I think, is what you're talking about, right or wrong, fact or supposition.
Yeah, no, I mean it's interesting. You mentioned about the captain going down with the ship. I mean that is the ultimate sort of sacrifice and showing responsibility for what's happened. And you could see that he had no thought for his own survival. That, in fact, one of the things that people have always assumed is that he was kind of inactive. And again, this goes back to cinematic portrayals. I mean, James
Cameron did him no favors with that portrayal.
Beautiful film, and Bernard Hill. Well, I mean, Bernard Hill is brilliant in the role. I mean, Bernard Hill's from Manchester, which is not too far from Stoke-on-Trent, which is where Smith came from. So the accent, everything is great, but he kind of defaulted to the cinematic trope that Smith was inactive, that he kind of went around in a bit of a stupor. And yet, and hopefully, as you can see in the book, I mean, there's about 1,000 N references, so it's all very well documented in the book, is that there are accounts that place Smith all over the ship, interacting with passengers and crew, damage reports, wireless messages. He was very active. A 62-year-old at midnight, dealing with an insurmountable disaster unfolding before him. He didn't just stand around. He was very active.
Oh God, you just said 62, and that's my age, and now suddenly I'm thinking I should be Captain Smith for Halloween. I always think of him as the old gentleman up there, but now, oh dear.
62 is young. 62 years young. I mean, I do think the retirement age in England was 65. It's now been raised to 67. And it is an interesting thing, actually, because a lot of people assume that it was going to be Captain Smith's final voyage. I mean, obviously it ended up being so, but it wasn't intended. Like, his retirement date had not been set. So he could have gone on to captain the Britannic after Titanic for another year or so, because as I said, the retirement age was 65 for captains of the day. So people do make that assumption. It's a bit of a myth that it was his final voyage, and hence he was, a little bit cavalier about speed and warnings, which was just not the case. I mean, he was a very disciplined man, and in fact, one of the officers calls him a disciplinarian. So to think that he kind of just suddenly let anything happen, and also they were Royal Navy Reserve trained. He was decorated for his time during the Boer War, so he was in a way a Navy man. So there's no way he would have just sort of stood back and done nothing. And all the evidence does point to him being a very active participant.
Did you ponder on or think about the psychological status of his presence of mind, even with naval training, even with, there's this element of shock when you describe when people assume that he was sort of walking around in the stupor, which was slightly leaned into in the film. I do agree, is that he could have just been like in that unbelievable pre-panic state of wonder and awe, and how could this be happening, and how could this be happening to me, and how could this be happening to this ship?
I mean, going back to your analogy of the film director, I'm quite sure, I've directed my own films, and there were moments when you think, oh, this is all falling apart. What am I going to do? But I'm sure that Smith must have gone through that. In fact, there are reports where he talks about having tears in his eyes. There's another report of him chewing a toothpick. He was a cigar smoker, so I have this personal theory that was his way of coping with not smoking at moments, because White Star regulations where you weren't supposed to smoke while on duty. So there's other things that do show he was stressed, But the thing that really stands out to me, and this is a bit of a plot spoiler, but I don't mind it because I think it's an important thing, is his final act on Titanic was to try to save the life of a child. In fact, maybe children, maybe two of them. And I think this gives us a real insight into his psychology, because as I just mentioned, his daughter had just turned 14 on the 2nd of April. He just made it in time for her birthday from Belfast to Southampton. They arrived 3rd of April, so he just made it. I think family was on his mind in those final moments. He was no doubt seeing couples, separated, families being separated. He was no doubt seeing this happening and the horror of what was happening, but also realizing that he was no longer going to be able to see his family. And that the reports are quite consistent. George Behe, the brilliant Titanic author, researcher, he's also written a book that was released a year before mine, which also uses these same accounts, or some of them are slightly different, actually. I kind of wish we could have compared notes before he released books, really. But his accounts also made him come to the conclusion that Smith was trying to save the life of a child. I mean, he wasn't successful in doing so, but he was trying to do it and had no thought to his own survival. So for me, that's a real insight into his psychology.
We hear these stories, Dan, and you wonder, like, when any of the screenwriters were making their film adaptations and they had to portray Captain Smith. We hear everything from that he was saving children, or that he was calling out "Be British," or that he was seen in the water. There are some, you detail all of the wild conspiracy theories that he was actually found many years later in a boat, believing it was still the night of in 1912. I mean, there's so many scenarios, including a very popular one of its time, where that he had shot people and or committed suicide himself in a variety of places and times. What do you come away with? What do you think, to your best interest, knowledge, would be his ultimate fate? Or do you just sort of say, I'll listen to all of them. We'll never know.
I mean, I would, if you'd asked me that question before I wrote the book, my answer would have been I don't know. And in fact, I probably would have even gone with the cinematic version, because him in the wheelhouse with the wheelhouse windows imploding, which apparently was Bernard Hill's idea. I did hear that. I'm not entirely sure that's true. Is a incredibly dramatic way of dying in the wheelhouse, and the center of command. It seems right. After doing the research, though, it's very clear that he jumped off the bridge, off the wing bridge, part of the bridge, into the water, and tried to save the life of at least one child swimming towards upturned Clapsable B. But once he arrived there, I mean, there was already, as we know, I think the number of about 30 men ended up on Clapsable B. There was no room for him, but he wasn't in. He didn't even consider there being room for him. He swam away, and it's interesting actually. The very first film that really showed the sinking of the Titanic in 1912, August 1912. I mean, it wasn't actually the very first, because there was a Dorothy Gibson film that came out slightly earlier than that. But the one that portrayed with a model sinking and what have you was a German film called In Night and Ice, and it actually shows Smith swimming to this upturned lifeboat, trying to deliver the child, who ends up, of course, not surviving, and then swimming away. And the very final shot is his cap just floating on the ocean. And I think, personally, they got it more dramatic in 1912 than James Cameron did in 1997. Because even though that implosion is very dramatic, actually, he died trying to save a life of a child. I find that even more dramatic. And I think the evidence is quite clear. I wouldn't. We can't say 100% about anything Titanic. We can't say 100%. But George Behe, we were communicating during the writing of our books, but he didn't want to share his notes, which is fine. We came to independent conclusions, and our conclusions are the same. And his take on Smith is quite a negative one. He does tend to toward the line of reasoning that Smith was to blame. I'm now the other way after having done the research, and yet we've come to the same conclusion on the way he ended. So I do think it's quite. It does sound almost too good to be true in some ways. It sounds like an urban legend, but then the accounts are very consistent, and I think you should look at eyewitness accounts in their entirety. And I think when you do that, you can see this very clear trend. When it comes to the suicide, sorry,
I was going to say, you go into the reaction by the public also was torn. I mean, you would have him memorialized in the form of a statue on one hand, and remembered as a hero and lauded as such, and then on the other hand, quite vilified by his contemporaries. And what a terrible position that put his widow and daughter in.
Yeah, I mean, and they had to leave Southampton. I mean, there's no statue, or I don't even think there's even a mention of his name in Southampton. There is a memorial in his hometown of Hanley, Stoke-on-Trent, and there's a statue in Lichfield, which is kind of the key city of Staffordshire. So yeah, it seems an unusual choice, but there is some logic to it. And yet there was a reluctance as time went on. Initially, if you look at the first newspaper reports, he is portrayed quite heroically. But then as the kind of reality of the scope of the disaster, of how many people died, and the lost opportunities and everything, it all kind of combined to create this very negative feeling about Smith. And I think this has been perpetrated thanks to Hollywood to some degree. And I'm hoping that this book maybe will reset that conversation, because I think it needs to be reset.
We always see that the character of, and I mean the role, not the fortitude, the character of Captain Smith always seems to be easily pressured by Ismay. Oh, let's get in faster, Speak to now the integrity character of Captain Smith. Would he have ever been the type of commander who could have been thus pressured?
Well, I think when you look at something like this, you need to look at their track record. It's like anyone. When you trust somebody, it's normally based on previous experience. In the case of Smith, if you look at the maiden voyage of the Olympic, they actually were making extremely good time on that maiden voyage, and then they hit fog. And what did Smith do? He immediately slowed down, and they lost about an hour and a half. Did Ismay pressure him then? Well, I mean, we don't know, but he certainly didn't listen. So I don't think there's any reason to believe any differently when it comes to the Titanic, that he would have listened. I mean, no doubt there is going to be this pressure because Ismay, is chairman of the White Star Line, and there's all that, context to it. But at the end of the day, his responsibility is to the ship and the people aboard it. And he's shown by his track record that he will slow down if there is doubt. In the case of Titanic, there wasn't doubt because they had clear visibility straight to the horizon. So as far as he was concerned, they would be able to spot an iceberg in loads of time before, having to take action. That was his mindset. It wasn't a case of him trying to break speed records or just being cavalier about icebergs. He was safety conscious, Smith. His track record shows that he was very regular with lifeboat drills. He wasn't averse to whatever safety protocols were around. And so I think it's very unfair that people are painting him as being this kind of cavalier person who was just, who cares about iceberg warnings? There's not. The iceberg warnings were documented. This is one thing that's often people say that Smith and his officers ignored iceberg warnings, which is blatantly false because the iceberg warnings that they received were tracked. They were plotted, and the problem with an iceberg, coordinate is that as soon as you receive it, it becomes almost worthless because they move. They travel around in currents and things. So but nonetheless, they still plotted it, and they were aware. In fact, they calculated that they would reach ice by 11 o'clock. So to say that Smith ignored warnings is really quite unfair.
Those of us who are creatives, whether it's filmmakers, authors, painters, we tend to fall a little bit in love with our subjects as we're working on it. And so I'm wondering a twofold question. If there's a particular film version of Captain Smith to which you gravitate or prefer, and then also as to whether or not you have any Captain Smith memorabilia there in your home, or if you could have anything, how does Captain Smith live in your day-to-day life now outside of the book?
Well, it's kind of interesting because before the book, my interest in Smith was quite limited. I was more interested in First Officer Murdoch, and then I became quite interested in Chief Officer Wilde because he was kind of considered an enigma. So I'll be honest, my interest in Smith is quite recent, but it was Walter Lord once gave some advice to another author and said, never fall in love with your subject. It's a biographer's trap, is that as soon as you start researching them, you can fall in. I've read, and there's a few really good Titanic historians who've written very good books, but they've clearly fallen in love with their subject. And I was determined not to do that. And I don't think I have, because I'm very open to the, Smith was not perfect. His organization of the lifeboat evacuation was quite messy. There was a lot of miscommunication, a lot of, you had Murdoch on the starboard side, who was, women and children first, and you had Lightoller, women and children only. So you had this kind of disconnect with information like that going on. And so Smith really he could have done better.
Isn't it amazing? Like your whole life depends on just what side of the ship you were standing on. It's amazing.
Or a simple phrasing of a sentence.
I know, but I think Smith, being in overall charge of that, could have done something about it. So I'm very open to that. I'm also open to. I mean, the book does detail what happened to his daughter and family. Most of it's quite tragic to some degree. But I've also played on the other side, which is the positive side of that story. And when it comes to memorabilia, yes, I have quite a few newspapers from 1912. A lot of them appear in the book. So I love
the photos in the book. The book, the audience should be aware that it's exhaustively researched, but it's also quite entertaining. And spend, I'd say, correct me if I'm wrong, I would say maybe 2/3 of the book focuses on Captain Smith, and then we get into his surviving daughter and her husband, who was a spy. I mean, it's fascinating, and there's great drama that goes throughout the book, and all those marvelous photographs as well.
Yeah, there's 130 photographs. In fact, the publisher only wanted 100, but I just pretended I couldn't count. Originally, there was 256 images. So I think as a filmmaker, you realize the power of visuals to tell a story. When you read about it and then you see it there, it can be really quite a powerful connection. A lot of books, they just have the photographs in the middle section, and you end up just finally getting to those photographs, and it's almost too late by that stage. So I was quite adamant with the publisher. Amberley were very good, actually, because I didn't think that they would say yes to this, but I said, look, I really want the photographs to be with the text, so as you're reading it, you can see them, and then you really visualize it. And there's some amazing photographs. For example, there's a photograph of Captain Smith's son-in-law a month before he mysteriously died, and he was working as an MI5 spy. So there's a real quite a bit of mystery there. And there was this photograph of him a month before he died. Things like that I just suddenly discovered that for me are really powerful in telling the story.
And fair to say, this young man was sort of a prototype for the James Bond character in many ways. Like this was a real full-fledged spy.
That's right. Yeah, he was an MI5 operative during the 20s. During the 20s with the Bolsheviks and what have you, there was a bit of concern in England over Russians infiltrating newspapers and what have you. So MI5 were getting MI5 spies and what have you to track people that were potential sympathizers and what have you. So Sidney Russell Cooke, Captain Smith's son-in-law, was one of them, but he did a terrible job. And again, going back to what you're saying about not falling in love, the book really shows how he messed up his mission, and whether this also ties into his mysterious death later is again something I've done as much research as possible to place all the pieces there, and then let the reader be the Sherlock Holmes and come up with their conclusion, because
spoiler alert, we don't really know how we know the circumstances of his death, but not really the cause of death, or maybe that's reversed. We know the cause of death, but not the circumstances that led to it.
It's interesting because I would have agreed with you until probably 2 weeks ago, because I received an email from one of the descendants, Captain Smith's daughter, not too dissimilar to her parents. She had a clause in her inheritance that if she remarried, she would lose it all, right? And so she never remarried, but she had quite a few boyfriends. And one of the boyfriends, a descendant of that relationship, has just finished the book, and he's mentioned in the book because his father was the painter, David Rold. And he said he read the book and he said, Dan, I know the answer. And he gave me some very, very good, quite compelling evidence that I think, yeah, that this wasn't a clear-cut case of accidental death. There was something more than that. I won't say anything more.
Mel, the daughter, there's a marvelous picture of her when she became a pilot, and it reminded me, Alexandra, you'll appreciate this. It reminded me so much of the after story for Kate Winslet's character in the Cameron film, because that she went on to lead a very privileged, hanging out with royalty, but also she was an adventuress. She was an aviatrix, and she went on to marry and have children, and all the she led quite a full, albeit tragic, life.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because there's a couple of discoveries where like the hairs stand up and you get really excited. And that was one of them, was fine, because I'd read about her being a pilot, and I just thought, wow, wouldn't it be nice if you saw a photograph? Similarly, with Captain Smith and his wife, there's always that photograph of her with the baby Mel, but I wanted to see what she would look like with her husband, as a couple. And when I found a photograph of that, and also I was interested in finding a wedding photograph of her marrying this MI5 spy. Found a photograph of that. So those photographs are really quite special, and her, as a pilot is quite amazing. It's interesting because just before getting her license, she actually crashes her plane. Was involved in a plane crash. So
Can't
there are
blame
a
the
lot of
ice for that.
crashes.
It was a pigeon. It was the engine.
But yeah, it's sadly there are a lot of crashes because her son, Simon Russell Cooke, was an RAF pilot who also crashed his plane. Um, so yeah, it is a life of tragedy. But hopefully, I've focused on the inspirational side of it because she was a very hospitable, very strong mind, a woman, quite advanced for the time, and yet you can kind of see the roots of it because I do explain how, for example, Simon Russell Cooke's mother was an early suffragette, quite a prominent one, wrote books and what have you. So it's not unusual to see how this kind of affected the family. They got into politics. Um, Women in politics again in those early years wasn't so popular, but they were giving it a go.
I love that
And
she embraced the Titanic legacy finally, as you know, as a grown woman. I don't know how close it came to the end of her life, but in her middle age, is it fair to say? But when the film versions were coming out, and she got involved with the Titanic community, like our version today, we're just the Titaniacs, but for Mel, she was hanging out with Titanic survivors and going to the premieres of the film and discussing. She was a vocal participant in the Titanic legacy, which I think is a surprise to many of us.
sorry.
I'm also thinking about the effect of the First World War and the loss of, an entire generation of men gave space for women of any gumption to be suffragettes, to be pilots, to be politicians, to take up the mantle where there was a huge gap, and gave an opportunity to those kinds of women. So that's where my mind's going when you're talking about that. And of course, she married a spy. Of course, she had gumption.
I mean, I was just going to say, because you mentioned about World War One and the effect that had on women, but I actually think in Mel's case, it was specifically the disaster that befell her family that caused her to almost like distract herself. She became not only a pilot, but she was collecting paintings and driving fast cars and doing all these kinds of other things that, in a way, I think distracted her from the tragedy that she had been through. And so she became quite an independent woman. And as you mentioned about going to the film premieres, she did not like the portrayal of Smith in the 1953 film. She was horrified. There's a classic quote that's in the book where she really explains her displeasure of the portrayal, and then hence actually met Lawrence Naismith, who plays Captain Smith in A Night to Remember, and there's a photograph of her meeting him on the set of the bridge. But I think also the other photograph that's also very, very interesting is that I discovered only just before the book went to print was her meeting some of the other survivors, Lawrence Beasley, for example, because it was this photograph. There's a very famous photograph of Lawrence Beasley and Violet Jessop, and some other survivors pointing at these deck plans. And I've seen this many, many times. But I also had a photograph of Mel with the similar deck plans behind her. And I just happened to chance upon it. There's a collector in England who owns the rights to that image. He had posted the uncropped version, and there was Mel.
He'd
And no
cropped
one
her.
realized it. No one had realized that was Captain Smith's daughter was in the photo as well. He didn't know that, and he very kindly gave me the rights to put it in the book. Because everything in the book I had to clear that the rights.
Sure.
There's over 200 permissions in the book. But he kindly gave me the rights to reprint that photograph, which I think is fantastic.
Yes, isn't it amazing in this day and age when we think we have everything? There's nothing mysterious left to find. We've got it all. And to hear that story just goes to show you that there are amazing discoveries still to be found. Well, I do have to say there is so much material in here. Titanic Legacy, The Captain, The Daughter, and The Spy. When you come to New York, you have to sign my copy. Although I don't usually deface my books, and you probably can't tell on camera here, but I have dog-eared so many pages because I was so excited to talk to you about it. So you will, when
Brilliant.
you come to New York, you will sign my dog-eared copy. And what's next? Is there another book in the works? More Titanic? Something completely different?
I mean, at the moment, there's now a second edition of the book that's just come out, and I think you, by the look of it, you had the first edition. The
Of
second
course.
edition looks exactly the same, but you can, if you want to know the difference, it says praise for Titanic Legacy on the back. That's the only kind
Oh
of
yes, yes. Well, you've got reviews now.
yeah, got reviews. So there is a second edition that's just been released in July, and I guess at some point there'll be a paperback. But as for another book, I mean, I never entered this with any aspirations for being an author. I was very happy being a collector. I collect Titanic books. I've got hundreds, and I was very happy being a consumer. But the story just landed on my lap, and Gary Cooper, who's another Titanic author, basically said to me, "Dan, you've got to write it." So I did, but it would take another story to do the same. I don't want to be one who's just forcing another book. It would have to be justified as because I think the story in there is fascinating. About a spy and what really happened to his family, which has never been. And I don't think, like you said, I don't think we should ever assume that there's no new material out there. There is. There's archives out there that are being digitized that could reveal some quite stunning information. So I think, yeah, never assume that there's nothing new. There's always something new to find.
It's a lesson for all of us. We are so grateful to you for writing the book and then of course, for joining us here today on Titanic Talk.
Thank you
Good
so
luck with
much,
it.
Dan. Thank you.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. Yeah.
You
You're
too.
part of the family now. You're stuck with us.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review. And if you'd like to hear more podcasts like this, hit the subscribe button. For information on where you can see Ship of Dreams, Titanic Movie Diaries, go to shipofdreamsfilm.com. Titanic Talk is a production of Ship of Dreams Film Limited. We've launched a line of Titanic Talk merch. A cap, a mug, a tote, a t-shirt or a hoodie. You'll be sure to find a unique gift for the Titaniac in your life. Look for the link in the notes and on Instagram, or go to bit.ly/Titanic Talk Shop.